Hey, everybody. I'd say good afternoon to you. My name is Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project and your host for Lunch with Lincoln today. Today, appreciate everybody's patience. It is 1 o'clock in the East. It is 10 o'clock in the West. My guest today will be Miles Taylor. We're just tracking him down, and as soon as we find him, he'll join me. But guys, this week is all about the January 6th committee. Um, it is the hearings that will begin on Thursday night, 8 p.m. in prime time in the East. And they are going to be, I think, pretty interesting. I think that they'll be pretty damning. And I think that they might very well be pretty upsetting. But it's also going to be a reminder of why these events are of such importance to our current state, but also our history. And I would say that probably only a few times since the late 1850s, prior to the Civil War, did we see an event like this. And even then, right, we never saw a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of the Capitol. And I think just to take a minute back through that day, I was talking to my dad back then, and it's hard to believe it's been almost a year and a half. And he said it was a little bit like when you see a tsunami, right? You see the water moving away from the beach and you go, what is going on there? What is that? What is that? And then you see the water start rushing back in. And that's what he said. That was the feeling he had as he saw all those people storming the steps of the Capitol, a place that my dad worked for many, many years in the 80s and 90s, and a place he's known intimately. And I can remember that day with there was a sinking feeling. There was this sort of cold chill down my spine. I remember getting a text from a friend of mine in Egypt, and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, I'm not okay." And he said, "I wouldn't expect you to be." He said, "We're used to this kind of political violence. We know you're not." And guys, I think that political violence is one of those things that once it gets into the political stream in a country, it's very, very difficult to get out. And we saw that 2020, prior to January 6th, was replete with that. We saw that 2021 was replete with it as well. We saw just a couple of weeks ago up in Buffalo, a young man, driven by, the idea of a great replacement theory, went in and killed many people who were just trying to pick up groceries for their families. And so political violence is a very dangerous thing. It is a sickness. As I said, once it gets into us, it's very difficult to get out. And so what do we expect to hear this week? Well, the committee's been working for a long time on this, right? They formed probably about a year ago. Last summer, they had the police, I believe three of the police officers who served that day, who were beaten that day, who were injured that day, get up and testify about the just visceral violence that they encountered, the visceral racism that they encountered. And we should not let those gentlemen, those officers, let their testimony go by. We also should not forget the numerous officers who were either severely damaged that day or lost their lives either that day or because of that day. Several of them took their own lives. And so what I think we're going to see is much more in the way of firsthand documented evidence of what not only happened on that day, but what led up to that day, because this is an important thing, guys. In the summer of 2020, we had a conversation with Mary Trump, Donald Trump's niece. And I asked her, I said, if he loses, is he going to go quietly? And she said he won't. And I said, why not? She said, because this is a man who only cares for his personal safety. If he believes that his body, if he will be personally safe, then he'll be willing to do almost anything. And even at that time, and even to this moment, there are men and women of the United States Secret Service who pledged to lay down their lives for Donald Trump's. At that moment on January 6th, he was sitting inside a fortress at the White House. He knew he would be safe. He knew he would be safe. So what was going on down Pennsylvania Avenue was something that he, by some recorded accounts, sort of took pleasure in. We see these stories now that, maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing if his vice president, his sitting vice president, Mike Pence, was hung. That, in the weeks leading up to January 6th, Mark Short, then Mike Pence's chief of staff, alerted his Secret Service detail leader that he was concerned that there was a threat on Pence's life. And that threat came from the president of the United States. These are unprecedented things in any country, but even more so in the United States, because we hold ourselves up to a higher standard. We hold ourselves up to believing that we are exceptional, that we're better than this. And when we elect people who discount those values, and in fact, devalue the belief system that so much of this country is based on. And believe me, gang, democracy is based on belief. We have laws, we have institutions, we have three branches of government, but it only works when all 320 million of us agree that that is the system in which we want to live under. And what we saw is that it only took one guy, Donald Trump, to start to disrupt all that. We showed that it only took one guy, Donald Trump, to open a Pandora's box, and that Pandora's box had MAGA inside of it, to unleash these things across the country. And the end result of it, we have not seen. But a way station in that was January 6th, where we saw those people go. Many of them, in body armor, carrying weapons, maybe not firearms. Maybe they were carrying firearms. We don't know. But they went there with the intent of stopping a peaceful position of power for the first time in 244 years. It almost worked, right? It almost worked. And so what I think you're going to see is more evidence of who was involved, when they were involved, how they were involved. And I think it's going to be very, very damning. And so I think that what we at the Lincoln Project will be doing, starting with this broadcast and going through this entire week, and in fact, through this entire process, is doing what we have been doing since that day, which is no less than democracy is on the ballot. And people could say, okay, well, nobody votes on democracy. It doesn't really matter. It does matter. It does matter. It matters more than anything, because without it, none of the rest of what we believe in is possible. None of the rest of the things that we believe, are common issues among us, right? Whether or not that's the economy, inflation, the environment, gun violence, right? Individual liberty. None of those things are possible without democracy, right? Now, let's talk about what you're going to hear from Republicans. So if you've learned anything from us as former Republicans, and if you've learned anything from Trump and Fox and Tucker Carlson, is that they are incredibly message disciplined, right? When they get on message, they stay on message. And until and unless something disrupts that, they are able to drive a message that throws up enough dirt and throws up enough noise to make sure that whatever the key issue is of the day is blocked out, is faded out. Welcome, Miles Taylor. I was doing a little bit of filibustering here while we were waiting on you, but thank you for joining me. Everybody.
Yeah,
Miles
no
Taylor.
problem. Sorry about that, Reed. I was a little bit late getting to you, and
no worries.
I'm thrilled to be joining you today, my friend.
The poor folks watching had to hear me blather on for 7 minutes, but I'm glad you could join me. So, Miles, so for everybody out there, if you don't know, Miles was a senior official at the Department of Homeland Security. Wrote an op-ed in, was it 2019, Miles?
2018.
2018, describing the danger that an insider saw from inside that administration, and ultimately wrote a book about his experiences, and now is the executive director of RAM. And remind me what RAM stands for. The Renew America Movement. Thank you. My notes have gone out the window here. And so, Miles, I want to thank you for joining me today. So the first question I want to ask is last month, I believe, you left the Republican Party, something I did in 2016. But everybody takes their own path there. But before we get to January 6th, just give everybody a sense out there of why you made that decision, because it's like leaving a tribe. It's not an easy thing for folks to do.
Yeah, well, and Reed, for guys like you and I, we've sort of made our entire careers around this tribe.
Right.
So, look, no one's got to have sympathy for me, but that's the challenge is your whole life is built around this institution, and trying to advance good public policy solutions through it. So for me, look, I had the view when Donald Trump was elected that he was an aberration. Now, that in hindsight looks remarkably naive. Right. But at the time, the trajectory we were going on as a party was a GOP that was trending towards socially liberal and fiscally conservative, right? The culture wars were going to be issues of the past. Guns and gay marriage and pot, those were all things that were going to slowly fade away and not become issues that the GOP fought with the Democrats on, and it was going to be about principle, and it was going to be about political philosophy and the things that had made me a conservative in the first place. Donald Trump was a total divergence from that path, the path that Paul Ryan and others were trying to take the Republican Party down. I, again, viewed that as an aberration. Stayed in the Republican Party in hopes that once we got rid of him, we would sort of go back the direction that we were going. Really, for me, it was a lot of things that had built up. But after the terrorist attack in Buffalo, it was clear not only that the GOP wasn't going to be going back that direction, that efforts of people like me to try to bring the Republican Party back towards the center were failing, but it was worse than that. The GOP wasn't just increasingly vitriolic, it was actually inspiring people to engage in violent radicalism. Now, I've spent most of my career in national security, and of that time, most of it in counterterrorism. I've spent my focus on ISIS and Al Qaeda and going after those bad guys. What we are seeing from the modern Republican Party is not dissimilar at all from what we saw when we looked at the radicalization of some of those terrorist movements. I mean, it sounds really hyperbolic to say that. I would have imagined 5 years ago that I would be saying something like that, but it's true. That rhetoric that we are seeing is translating into justification for acts of violence. And you led off, the lunchtime chat here, Reed, by talking about the spike we are seeing in political intimidation and political violence. It is a direct result of the rhetoric we're seeing from the pro-Trump, pro-Putin MAGA wing of the Republican Party. It's leading to sort of physical manifestations of that, dissatisfaction. That is terrifying. It's unprecedented, and the numbers certainly show it. So, look, that was my journey. Was sort of a wake-up call and realizing, no, we're not going to fix this thing from the inside. The only way we're going to fix the GOP is from the outside. And by, frankly, defeating Republicans at the ballot box, especially the radical Republicans, and going out there and putting forward alternatives.
Well, I think that's right, and we all take our own journey on these things, and it can be a difficult one, and you can wrestle with it. You lose friends. To your point, you lose. You're saying, okay, well, I've got a career, right? I mean, I have a lot of friends, Miles, as you do in Washington, D.C. You're like, look, I have a company. I have employees to take care of. I can't stand the guy. I can't stand any of this. But like, what do you want me to do? And I'm always like, well, oftentimes if you do the right thing, success will follow, or something new will follow. Before we get to January 6th, though, because it was one thing I mentioned before you jumped on. There was this revelation this week that I mentioned to the folks watching about Mark Short, Mike Pence's chief of staff, going to his Secret Service detail and saying, I have concerns about the vice president's safety, but from the president himself. Now, as you noted, and I think in a tweet last week, that when you were at DHS, one of the things in your portfolio was the Secret Service. I mean, I'm an old advanced man, right? So like my role in that world more junior, but I worked with those guys day in and women day in and day out, week in and week out, all over the country, all over the world. I always found them to be the utmost professionals. What kind of shockwave, or do you think there was a shockwave sent through the service with a concern like that being communicated?
Well, there's we're still sort of in the fog of war with this story a little bit. One, it's stunning to me. Two, I'll note up front that the Secret Service did respond to my tweet and said that they, had not received any indications basically at headquarters that this conversation had happened. But importantly, the New York Times has stood by their reporting, and we've not yet heard from one of the key parties in that news story, Mark Short, who was chief of staff to the vice president of the United States, who is reported to have gone to the head of the vice president's detail and said he had concerns on January 5th about what might happen the next day and potential threats to the vice president, with the fact that Donald Trump was seemingly preparing to turn on the vice president. That conversation and the way it played out doesn't surprise me for a number of reasons. One, because discussions like that were happening in those circles around that time period from people I know. There was a lot of alarm. Two, it doesn't surprise me that Mark Short in particular would have that worry. Mark has never been someone who is mega MAGA. I don't want to claim he's a so-called resistance guy like me from inside the administration, but but Mark was a very discerning pragmatist, and so it wouldn't surprise
Right.
me that he would have that conversation. Also, wouldn't surprise me that the head of Pence's Secret Service detail might not communicate that back to headquarters. There's a relationship. It's tough to describe, Reed. You know it well. The only way I can describe it is sort of broy. There's a broy relationship between the head of someone's Secret Service detail and the protectee themselves. So yeah, the head of that detail works for the U.S. Secret Service, but when they're defending that person, when they're willing to take a bullet for that person, they
Right.
treat that person basically as their boss.
Right.
And so it wouldn't surprise me if in confidence that individual hadn't gone back to headquarters and reported something very sensitive that Mark Short said. So push away the cobwebs. What does this mean? Like you, I've spent a lot of time with the service. I was on the House Appropriations Committee. I oversaw their budget for a number of years. On the Homeland Security Committee, I oversaw agency activities for a number of years. And then as DHS Chief of Staff, day to day, we oversaw their operations. And nothing like this has ever come on my radar in spending time with the Secret Service. Never, ever, ever has there been anything close to this. And not only that, as a student of history and of that agency in particular, nothing like that has happened in Secret Service history, where
Right.
one of their protectees feels physically threatened by another. In this case, the president versus the vice president. That is historic. And I think in a way, I would actually argue this is the closest thing we've seen to a smoking gun for the insurrection and Trump's intent to incite insurrection. That his own number two was worried about the president provoking violence should be a smoking gun, that Donald Trump intended to provoke violence. I mean, how much more damning could it get? Do we need Donald Trump writing in blood on a napkin, I intend to incite violence tomorrow? I mean,
Right.
what the fuck else do we need? The vice president of the United States of America was potentially, allegedly, reportedly worried about his own safety because the president was going to incite violence against him.
Well,
that's more than a
and
smoking gun. We found the shell casing basically in this news story.
well, and to zoom into January 6th and the Capitol on that day, just to switch gears a little bit, the vice president refused to get in the limousine. He wouldn't get in the limousine with his own agents. He's like, I don't know what's going to happen if I get in that car with you. And he chose to stay in the building. I assume they have a safe house or a safe room or something in the Capitol building for him. But Miles, I was just telling the folks before you joined us that, on Thursday night, we're going to hear from not for the first time, but for the first time in a while from the January 6th committee. It sounds like just, we've seen sort of dribs and drabs of text messages and video and documents and reporting from the New York Times and others. So what's your sense of what we're going to see, on this first night of 6, which I hope they'll decide to take more, but if it's 6, we'll take what we can get.
Well, Reed, I'd heard you walking through that, and I thought you gave a really good summary. This is going to be groundbreaking because of the synthesis, not necessarily because we're going to get revelation after revelation that we haven't heard of, although it does sound like the Select Committee intends to reveal things publicly that have not previously been revealed. But it's bringing it all together into a story and telling that true story. We can be shocked by each individual revelation over many months that ends up in the newspapers, but when you see this stitched together as a story, I think it will be unequivocally clear that Donald Trump intended to incite people to engage in an effort to disrupt the transition of power. And the evidence will overwhelmingly support that. And I think what's going to capture the public imagination, frankly, shock the conscience of the public, is to see that weave together into the true story of how this played out, but in a behind the scenes way we haven't yet heard. And we've seen reports that people who've given depositions in front of the committee, some of their testimony will be released by video and by audio. Again, previously unknown details about how events transpired in the White House in the lead up to and after that day. And we may see some surprise witnesses come forward and say things publicly that we have not yet heard. But again, at the end of the day, I think we're going to see, the true story here. And it's going to be evident to the discerning listener that Trump, very likely broke the law here. And I want to say something, Reed, about, predicting this. It not only is it not a stretch to think that Donald Trump wanted to see people engage in acts of violence to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. It was the likeliest outcome here. I mean, 1 year before the election, and I don't want to be that guy that says, "Well, if you read my book, no one needs to read my book." But
read Miles' book.
Yeah, but a year before the election, I said in my book, "Look, we need to beat Trump, right? We need to beat
Right.
Trump. But even if we beat him, he will not go quietly." He
Right.
had already started to seed a narrative about coups being afoot and a potential civil war being in the offing. And he was exhorting his supporters well before the election, more than a year before the election,
Right.
to get ready essentially for a battle. And in my book, I said this is a narrative that's likely to end tragically and potentially violently even if he loses. And that's exactly what ended up happening. It was foreseeable. But I want to point something else out that I've talked about a little bit publicly and certainly will be a lot more this week, is
Mhm.
that it's my personal belief that Trump intended to incite an insurrection so that he could declare some form of martial law to deploy the military into the streets and prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Why do I say that? Because before I quit the Trump administration and protest, I was in meetings with the president where he talked about the Insurrection Act as a magical power that he had. He had been told by his lawyers that in extreme circumstances, he could invoke the Insurrection Act if
Right.
there was a violent mob attacking the United States, and he could use it to deploy the military. Now, Trump wanted to use that for years at the southern border. He would ask all the time, can I call this an insurrection? But he had this view that he had a superpower he could use, the Insurrection Act, to get something done as president that otherwise wouldn't be doable. So it was almost not surprising to me on January 6th when the term insurrection made its way into the public lexicon, because we'd heard that in the White
Yeah.
House and years prior. And so this was in Trump's mind. I mean, in law, as you know, Reed, there's a concept known as mens rea. Like, does the person who commits the crime, did they have the presence of mind to do it? Right? Were they thinking about that crime before they committed it, or was it just a crime of rage in the moment? In Trump's case, I would argue that there's clear mens rea. He'd been thinking for years, how can I foment a scenario that would justify me using those powers? Now, he didn't invoke the Insurrection Act, but boy, does it look like he was damn close to doing something along those lines, given what we saw. So that's just my personal assessment.
Well, and also just along the lines of that, on the flip side, there was a memo I saw online this morning, Miles, that proved that Chris Miller, who was the acting Secretary of Defense, held back the National Guard specifically and said the National Guard, the DC National Guard, may only be deployed with my order. And it was hours and hours and hours after this was happening that finally they let him go. But I want to go to the whole idea of the mens rea, the premeditation, because I'm going to mix my metaphors here, because you saw, he didn't want to lose, right? He couldn't handle the idea of losing. We knew, those of us who are unfortunate anthropologists of this person, understood he wasn't going to go quietly. But it was also, there were all these, they talk about disasters where it's like, if this thing hadn't happened, it wouldn't have happened. If this thing hadn't happened, it might not have happened. But you could go back to mid-December when the electors met in their state legislatures and actually cast their ballots, formally making Joe Biden president-elect. And none of the Senate Republicans or Senate members of the House would say he was the president-elect, right? Even after the media had called it. And then you see the likes of Mike Lee, senator from Utah, who is pointing the likes of the Kraken lady and John Eastman from California in his direction, saying these people could be helpful in making your case, right? And so all of these, did any of these people, right, did they provide Trump the necessary thing? But no, but they continued the fantasy and the fiction for him that allowed us to ultimately get to what occurred on January 6th, because no one was willing to say, do this, stop, you can't do this. He was going to replace the Secretary of Defense again. He was going to replace the director of Central Intelligence. And when those things happened, he said, fine. He probably didn't even think it really mattered at that point. But it seems like that there's the untold story, and we've seen it in some of the tweets and some of the text messages, not tweets, of these folks who were encouraging him to continue. Now, the Mike Lees of the world will say, well, I was always looking for a constitutional way to do this, right? Which is why he ultimately voted to certify Joe Biden's election. But let's be clear, like he is an accomplice to all this. And there are probably dozens, if not hundreds of other people like him.
Yeah, look, there absolutely are. I mean, the phenomenon of the Trump administration from a public servant perspective is there were a lot of people that went into that administration who'd never met Donald Trump, probably didn't even vote for Donald Trump, and were pretty spooked about his presidency, and went in with the view of trying to steady the ship. But by the end, largely those people had either quit or more likely been fired or pushed out, because Trump, you can give him credit for one thing, he's got a pretty powerful radar to identify people who've got a conscience. He knows who disagrees with him.
It's like kryptonite. When it comes near him, he's like, ah.
Oh, totally. I mean, but genuinely, and he identified those people,
right,
and he made very clear that they would be eliminated, and then he systematically eliminated them. If you just go back and look at the timeline, it's stunning. I mean, he just buried body after body of the people who would oppose him in the Oval Office. What you were left with was either sycophants, people who were true believers, of which there were very few actual true believers. I mean, most of those people still behind the scenes would say he's a psycho, but a useful psycho, or silent abettors, right? The people who know better but do his bidding anyway out of fear. Largely, the administration was populated by those folks at the very end. Read some. I mean, you and I know some of those people. We've lost friends that were those people that became those, what I think is one of the, as you know, one of the kind of untold stories in the lead up to January 6th is how many people were either silent abettors or active sycophants in the lead up to that moment. I mean, it can look like January 6th was just sort of something that popped up and it was a spontaneous mob, but there is really a stunning pattern of, frankly, bureaucracy leading up to this. I mean, before any presidential decision, there's a trail of bureaucracy, of papers and meetings and memos and people doing what, folks like you and I would call papering the record, Reed, is essentially setting the stage for the president to do a thing. There's this huge trail of that in the lead up to January 6th, from Capitol Hill into the White House, external allies, of them essentially setting the stage for this moment, for the attempted disruption of the counting of the votes, and ultimately towards something that ended violently. And they were pretty upfront about it. And I want to go to a comment that you made. I haven't read the details of the reports about the Chris Miller memo, but what I will say is anyone like us who served in government, who served in a presidential administration, was watching on January 6th and was astounded that something wasn't happening more quickly in response. Now, let me put an asterisk on that and say, yes, government moves glacially slow. But when something like that is happening, it doesn't take a junior staffer to write a memo, to go up to the military, to go up to the president. No, the president of the United States would have been watching that mob and that develop. And if he had wanted to stop it, it would have been one phone call to the Pentagon to say, throw everything you have at the situation to stop this from happening. We don't have that phone call. What we actually have is hours and hours of Trump apparently waiting to see what would happen. And I got to tell you, the news about Pence rocked me this week. It really did, genuinely, because to me, it cemented what had been a supposition in my head. And that supposition was Trump wanted to wait and see if the mob, if the mob was successful, and potentially whether they took out the vice president of the United States. We'll never know what was happening in his head, but from people, who were in the orbit, he was watching gleefully. And I genuinely think he was waiting to see, did something like that happen? Were members of Congress taken hostage? Was the vice president of the United States captured? And God forbid something worse. I think Trump waited because he waited to see whether one of those moments would happen. And when it was clear that those things weren't happening, then the decisions were made to go in and provide the support necessary. But it's damning nonetheless. That gap in time is absolutely damning to anyone who's ever served in government and knows the president could have just made a phone call to have stopped this.
Well, and I think this is a really important piece too, because this is something that we have also put out there as a supposition, is that not only Trump, but all these other people right? Whether or not it's, Republican leaders, Republican ass kissers, Republican elected officials, they wanted to see if it was going to work too, right? So they didn't want to be on the wrong side of something, right? If they thought, oh, okay, well, this is going to happen, I'll just stand up. And then on that day, Miles, we actually saw. I was fascinated. We ran an ad, I don't know, probably last year, with all these text messages coming into Mark Meadows, right? Hannity said, make him stop. Laura Ingraham said, make him stop. Don Jr. said, make him stop, right? Kevin McCarthy said, make him stop. And so when the time came, a lot of like, oh, I don't want to cross that line, right? They weren't willing to go across with him. But in that moment from, say, January 7th until, I guess when the House finally impeached him again after he'd left office, there were a lot of people who were like, he's got to go down. He can never come back. I mean, Kevin McCarthy's on the phone saying, I'm going to go tell him to resign, right? All these other people. And now they're all closing ranks. I mean, Miles, you saw in the Axios story about, Matt Schlapp, one of those people who's out in Nevada and Arizona chasing the stolen ballots. It didn't exist. All of these people now, whether or not it's McCarthy or Elise Stefanik, right? They're all going to close ranks and say, this is a distraction. This is a witch hunt. None of this really matters. The American people don't care. Mitch McConnell, in true Mitch McConnell fashion, Miles, right, votes against impeachment, then gives a speech and says the whole thing's his fault. So it says the whole thing is Trump's fault. And so, I think, and there was a story probably about this time last year when I think the committee was formed by a Republican consultant in DC. I'm not sure who it was. I have some ideas. Who said if the 2022 election is about January 6th and Donald Trump, we're toast, right? So you can see why they don't want to talk about this anymore, because it will be so ugly and it will be front and center. And as you know, the only time you can see Republicans really go crazy nowadays, anyway, is when they know they're in trouble.
Oh, it's absolutely right. I mean, look at what they've done. Liz Cheney is the most rock-ribbed conservative you can think of.
Right.
And a year ago this time, they kicked Liz Cheney out of her job, and House Republican leadership later censured her and Adam Kinzinger. They are terrified of dissent from within the tribe. Nothing scares the Republican Party more than dissent from within the tribe and people actually focused on this event. They're doing everything to move on from it, but you don't have to believe me and Reed to know that. Just look at the actions these people have taken. I mean, Reed, as you said about Kevin McCarthy on tape, I'm not ready to say the name of the congressman, but there's a congressman from South Carolina. I'm working to get the final facts in place, but I know firsthand the night after the insurrection, he was ready to file impeachment articles himself. But then when he saw the wind was blowing the other way, he came out and staunchly defended the president. There's a whole raft of these Republicans who are having those conversations in private, who are about to be called out publicly for their hypocrisy. It was known that these folks were making sort of a politically convenient decision rather than focusing on what was right. That's really alarming. But what's even scarier to me, Reed, is the what's happened since. You or I could have made the case on January 7th, perhaps, that this was still not a fluke, but something that maybe didn't represent the majority of the Republican Party and was a radical fringe that needed to be put down. But now you can't make that case. Now the numbers tell a very different story. And I'll keep citing these numbers till I'm blue in the face or until the numbers change. But the fringe of the Republican Party that has been violent has now become the mainstream of the Republican Party. And I'll give you three stats. One is the QAnon conspiracy theory. Another is the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. And another is the stolen election conspiracy theory. These were all fringe before. Now, 50% of Republicans nationwide believe in core QAnon tenets. 50% of Republicans nationwide believe in the Great Replacement theory that was used by the Buffalo shooter to justify that terrorist attack. And 70% of Republicans nationwide believe the election was illegitimate or stolen from Joe Biden. A majority of the Republican Party has now been radicalized to believe these fringe conspiracy theories. And what's worse is those are the conspiracy theories that are being used to justify acts of political violence and intimidation. And as a result, studies have shown that attitudes towards political violence have exploded in this country, something like tenfold. 1 in 10 Republicans today think violence is justified now to restore Donald Trump to the White House. That is breathtaking as a public safety concern. Put aside politics. The fact that 1 in 10 Republicans believe we should forcibly reinstall Trump in the White House is a public safety and national security concern.
So, on that note, well, I got a couple of minutes left with you. As someone who's an expert in terrorism, and terrorism is terrorism, whether or not it occurs inside our shores or occurs someplace else. What can we do as individual Americans, right, to head this off? Because the picture you paint is pretty bleak, and it can be pretty scary for folks who are like, I got family, I got things I got to worry about, and now you've got these folks, and many of them are running around with guns. Remember the Proud Boys and all those other guys, the guys in the Hawaiian shirts with the machine pistols and all this other stuff. Like, how do individual Americans push back on this, understanding that the other side, one, as you said, has been willing to use violence or exhort violence, and two, that they see this as an existential fight, right? They see this as the difference between life and death and winning and losing everything.
Well, Reed, you know this. You spent some time at Homeland Security. In the public safety realm, we think about it as a spectrum of prevention, protection, response, and recovery. And I won't get too academic on you. I'll just say that three of those, protection, response, and recovery, are really important government functions. And a lot of work still needs to be done in domestic terrorism. Donald Trump, when I was at DHS, had no interest in domestic terrorism. His White House seemed to know that Trump's rhetoric was fueling it. We saw an uptick in the numbers. We and the FBI director were very, very worried about it. We briefed the White House. They refused to pay attention. They turned down our request to write a strategy focused on domestic terror. They didn't care about it. They didn't want to focus on it because they saw these individuals as political supporters, not as potential violent extremists. And so they buried their heads in the sand. And as a result, we're living with actual violent threats today. And by the way, domestic terrorism cases in all 50 states, not 47 or 48 or 49. Every single state in this country, the FBI now has a case into individuals who want to use these conspiracy theories as justification to go engage in acts of violence, not political free speech, violence. So what can the average American do about it? I'll focus on that prevention category. In all of the time we tried to disrupt ISIS plots and Al-Qaeda plots, there was one common theme in almost all of the disruptions. I can actually give you a number. In about 75% of the disruptions in a study that I had done, we found that one of the central factors in preventing an attack was community awareness, was literally the really boring thing we see on posters. If you see something, say something. That actually served as a tripwire in most of these cases and attacks that we stopped before they happened. Is in 75% of cases, it was a community member, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or a confidential informant who came forward and said, hey, I'm really worried about something that I'm seeing, and it tipped off law enforcement. I hate to say that we're in that window, but we are well past the point of like being able to suppress these conspiracy theories that are leading to violence. We are now in that window where there needs to be those tripwires across the country for community members to be aware of people who may engage in acts of violence, who are using this radical ideology to justify their behavior, and to make sure they let authorities know. I mean, that's very alarming. I didn't ever want us to be in this place, but we are. And I can remember in the lead up to the election, talking to friends that were still at the highest levels at the FBI, who were saying before the 2020 election, we are just seeing an explosion of cases. And we are so worried about what's going to happen in the post-election period. The handful of those folks that are still there are basically saying, yeah, the thing that we worried about several years ago when I was still in government with them has transpired, is now there's this mainstream radicalization that's transitioning to violence. So look, the community awareness piece is essential, but there's a longer term political piece, which is frankly, vote these people out. Vote the people out that are acting as a mouthpiece for fringe ideas that are being used to justify political intimidation and violence. It's the most important thing that we can do, is go to the polls and make sure that those folks never hold positions of public trust again.
Well, Miles, I want to thank you for joining me today. Folks, before we let you go, the original Antifa of the United States Army invaded the shores of Normandy 78 years ago today, June 6th, 1944. And to think that there was a leader, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, who sent those young men, Marines or airmen, Coast Guardsmen, into battle that day. He wrote a note to himself and he put it in his pocket in the case that the landings failed. And he said, if any blame attaches to it, it is mine alone. And Miles, to think that there was a man in his time and of his time, and who also, I think, went on to be an incredibly fair-minded and effective United States president. It was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And with that, we want to leave you with a little reminder of what those folks did 78 years ago today. I'll say thank you to Miles, and we'll see you all next week.
Who is Antifa? They stormed the beaches of Normandy, parachuted into the French countryside, and gave their lives to face down and fight back against fascism. They took down Nazi machine gun nests, tore apart the Third Reich's strongholds, liberated concentration camps. Anywhere Antifa saw fascism, they fearlessly and relentlessly annihilated it. Fascism was defeated because of patriots like these, proud Americans who knew that the fight against fascists was not simply a battle between opposing nations. It was a war against inhumanity, a war we still fight today. Anti-fascism, it's not a cable news talking point. It's an American ideal that should be memorialized because it was paid for in blood.
The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.